In 2018, 7 years ago, I was part of what was called the Forum Trust's Women's Legacy Project. That's the Forum Trust in the centre of the city. My particular brief was to research women from Norfolk, or with a Norfolk connection, who were in uniformed service and had died as a consequence of the war. So the aim of that project for me was to create for the first time a roll of honour of Norfolk women. It did not include women who died working in munitions, sadly we know that some did, in Zeppelin raids or in any other catastrophes of war. So this verse from a much longer poem is taken from the poem The Sisters Buried at Lemnos by Vera Brittain. And to date, we know of 25 Norfolk women in uniform service who died in or as a consequence of the First World War. I'll give you time to read the slides. I won't necessarily read them out for you. So here we have an identity bracelet, which women in uniform service would usually have worn. It states the name, A Hall, service number, religion, who they are serving with, I'll explain that abbreviation later, and where. It is indicative of the difficulties encountered tracing these 25 women, because A Hall was not her real name. She has attached a lucky black cat to her bracelet, but she certainly wasn't lucky. We'll find out more about her later. So how do we remember or commemorate those who died in the war? Getting any name on a war memorial was a pretty random affair, especially if you were a woman. Community memorials were often years in the planning and frequently caused controversy. For the 25 Norfolk women we're talking about today, their names are commemorated on various memorials. There are different memorials commemorating those who served. My research into these 25 women started at Norwich Cathedral. In 1919, Norwich Cathedral decided to build a war memorial chapel at the East End to commemorate Norfolk men who had died in the war. This house that you can see here was knocked down to make way for the chapel. In the immediate post-war years, there was no thought given to including women. So the house has been demolished, and here you can see where the chapel was going to be. And here is the chapel completed, but it wasn't completed until 1932, and this delay actually worked in the women's favour. Just 7 weeks before the chapel was due to be officially opened, it was agreed, well, it might be a good idea to include the women as well. So a letter went out in the press asking for people to propose women's names, but it did not specify the qualifying reasons to be included in their war memorial book. And this is why, for some of our women, their connection to Norfolk is not entirely clear. You'll note in the foreground to the left, Edith Cavell's grave there, down in the bottom corner, if you're sat at the back. And so, the Book of Remembrance was created. It was for the diocese, so we have to remember it did include some parishes over the Norfolk border. It is on view today in the cathedral if you visit the chapel. The very back page is the one dedicated to women, although some women, like Edith Cavell, were also included with their parish entry. Initially, there were 11 names on the list, alphabetical order. 2 were added later, but before the opening, and 2 were added after the opening. Some of our women are commemorated on the Women's Memorial screen at York Minster. Each door bears the crest of a regiment with the names inside. It was created using a surplus of funds following the restoration of the Minster's Five Sisters window in June 1925. And then we have war memorials. Where do you put them? Who do you include? In what order? These two photos are good examples of how women were put on, if at all. So Gladys Cobb was included at the same time as the men, with her brother Harry above. That's her name on the left. Susanna Hall's name, which you can see on the right, was added many years later. A few of our women have a Commonwealth war grave. The qualifying period for a war grave was from the 4th of August 1914 to the 31st of August 1921. Those women who died abroad usually have a Commonwealth war grave because they are buried in military cemeteries, but some in this country have one too. It's easy enough to see if one exists by searching their website, and it's also possible to still apply for one today. Not all Commonwealth war graves follow the traditional design we are familiar with. This is an example here. Many have sadly fallen into disrepair, again, like this one. This is the headstone for a lady called Beres Fanning. There are some other types of memorial too, some commemorating a group of people. So now let's look at these uniformed services that these women served in. We'll start with the nursing services and the Red Cross. It was an opportunity for women to serve both at home and abroad. Many worked in auxiliary war hospitals at home, country houses requisitioned for the purpose. Some were full-time, others volunteered, maybe at the end of their working day or at the weekends. QAMS, the Queen Alexander's Imperial Military Nursing Service, QAMS. They employed qualified nurses. In 1914, they had 297 nurses. By the end of the war, they had around 10,000. They served at home and abroad. They served in field hospitals, ambulance trains, hospital ships and barges, and casualty clearing stations. And then we have the Territorial Force Nursing Service, part of the Territorial Force. They were qualified nurses with at least 3 years training. In September 1914, over 2,000 were mobilised. Over 8,000 served in the war, over 2,000 of them serving overseas. Under the umbrella of free a man to fight, women were now encouraged to join the armed forces, as well as many other occupations previously denied to them. So here we see a poster for the Women's Royal Naval Service. Women would be allocated to a particular section within each service, generally domestic, administrative, technical, and a catch-all miscellaneous. This applied to all the armed forces. Many women already had transferable skills, so we see here the fisherwomen, the beatsters from Galston, skilled in net making, working on net mines. Many wrens in Norfolk also worked at Royal Naval Air Stations, such as the big one at Pulham. We don't know of any Norfolk women who were in the wrens who died. Then we have the WAC, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. Over 57,000 women enrolled in the WAC. All were mobile, initially working in the UK or abroad. The immobile section was formed in 1917, but that could still mean working far from home. In March 1917, the WACs were the first in uniform to be sent to battlefields in France other than nurses. Around 10,000 served in the British Expeditionary Force around Calais, Rouen, Boulogne, Dieppe and Etaples. Towards the end of the war, some served in Belgium, Italy and Greece. Some worked for the American Expeditionary Force and for the Royal Flying Corps. Many were not demobilised until after the men, and some not until as late as 1921. After demob, some took up the offer of free emigration, which was offered to all of the men's and women's services. And some took up that offer because they realised they had no jobs to go back to when they went back to England. As the strategic importance of aerial warfare developed, the RAF was formed on the 1st of April 1918. It was an amalgamation of the Army's Royal Flying Corps and the Navy's Royal Naval Air Service. The Women's Royal Air Force was formed at exactly the same time. This meant that Wrens and WACs working on air bases such as Pullham had the option to transfer to the Air Force, and most of them did. Around 30,000 WAFs, nicknamed penguins because they didn't fly, and most were immobile and they worked locally. Most served in Britain, but after 1919, some 500 were sent to Germany and France. Then we have the Women's Land Army, formed in January 1917. It was to increase numbers working on the land, but because women already were. The Women's War Agricultural Committee had been organising women for agricultural work long before then and continued to do so afterwards. And here at the Record Office has the only record found so far of the register of 9 women from Brampton near Aylsham who had registered for work long before the Women's Land Army was formed. Some of our women received various medals and awards alongside similar ones to the men, such as these. The campaign medals are the most common, the British War Medal and the Victory Medal. This is a Territorial Force Medal awarded to those nurses who'd volunteered for service overseas on or before September 1914. So basically they'd gone more or less straight away. This is a very special one, the ARC, the Associate of the Royal Red Cross Medal, awarded only to fully trained nurses for exceptional service in military nursing, and it was introduced in the First World War. This is definitely not a medal. This is a plaque that came with a commemorative scroll from King George V, issued to those families of personnel who had died in the war. The scroll came from King George V. 1,355,000 were issued in total. 600 of those were issued to women. So, connection to Norfolk. Let's begin by looking at the stories of 4 women whose connection to Norfolk was not clear at the beginning, despite the fact that they were all named in the cathedral book. So, Elsie, and please try and read the data as I do my reading, rather than me reading it all out for you. Elsie joined the Territorial Force Nursing Service immediately that war broke out. She stayed on in Rouen after the Armistice in 1918. In 1919, she succumbed to influenza, the great flu pandemic of that time. She came back to England for treatment. Despite still being unwell, she was ordered to go back to Cambridge to work at the hospital there. She lasted all of 2 weeks before she was too ill to work. She went to her family in Essex to recover, but her situation worsened. She was diagnosed with TB, and she was passed, like a parcel, to 4 different hospitals, each one saying they could not treat her. After the 4th hospital, Elsie and her close friend, Nurse Mary Brown, had had enough. Elsie went to stay with her friend Mary in St Tawney in Cornwall. She was officially discharged as medically unfit on the 9th of April, 1920. She died 9 days later. She's buried in St Tawney. Her grave, as you can see, is in a sad state of disrepair. She was let down by the very profession she devoted her life to. Her name is in the cathedral book, I think, probably because she had worked at Addenbrooke's Hospital and she had some Norfolk connections while she was there. Then Amy Alice Victoria Goldsmith, another Territorial Force nurse. She worked in Cambridge until 1917. In April of that year, she was sent to France to set up a hospital at Wimereux near Boulogne. She achieved the rank of staff nurse there, the highest rank in the Territorial Force service. And the text in orange is one of her nursing reports, thoroughly reliable and conscientious, kind, attentive to the patients, and her manner to them is very nice. At the end of the war, Amy wanted to join Quames, but she became ill and died of pneumonia on the 5th of March, 1919 in Marseille. She was, from the report, suffering from debility, gastritis, and pleurisy. She's buried at Mazargues War Cemetery in Marseille. She was born in Suffolk, but probably had some family connections in Norfolk, and they would have put her name forward for the cathedral book. Jessie Wakefield. She joined the Territorial Force Nursing Service immediately war broke out. She worked as a sister at Addenbrooke's, and it's highly likely that Jessie would have known Elsie Humphreys and Amy Goldsmith. Jessie left for France in May 1918, and she was put in charge of the nurses leaving with her. She worked in Étaples, which was the centre of the flu pandemic in 1918. And again, excellent nursing reports, and you can see there the ARC medal from the Red Cross that she had. In July 1918, Jessie contracted bronchitis and she returned to England to recover. She then went back to Étaples in November, and she died of septicemia and meningitis in February 1919. She's buried at Étaples Military Cemetery. Why Jessie's name was in the cathedral book had me baffled for months. Then, when I was asked to index the nurses' registers here at the Norfolk Record Office, there was Jessie's name. Not only that, but her photo too. The nurses' registers here are wonderful documents. So not only had she trained in Norwich, but it also explained her connection in the cathedral book. Frances Ethel Astel. Frances went to Salonika in January 1917, but in November that year she became ill and she died from appendicitis on the 17th of December. She was buried the following day at Micra British Cemetery in Calamaria. Again, I did not know at first why she was in the cathedral book, but it turned out that in 1917, her sister was working in Norfolk as a governess, and her mother had returned to Norwich, the city where she'd been born. Her memorial plaque and medals were sent to them, and it's likely they put forward her name. And the photo there on the right is a good example of a group memorial. That's the nurses' memorial for nurses lost in the war. There are some women we know very little about, and you have to realise that their short lives left little to know. Most were spinsters, and there are no descendants to trace. So Minnie Frost, again, Territorial Force Nursing Service. She was a special military probationer. These were employed by the War Office. We do not know the cause of death or where she died. She's listed in the cathedral book as coming from Honingham, as that is where her parents were living at the time of putting her name forward. So she had gone to work in Poole, and then she went to London to train as a nurse. But that's the information, the only information that we have on Minna. Evelyn Irene Morell. Evelyn's parents owned the Coffee Pot Inn at Downham Market. I'm looking at somebody in the audience there who's from Downham Market. Evelyn herself worked as a draper until she joined the Women's Royal Air Force when it formed in 1918. She worked as a clerk at Marham, and she was a victim of the flu pandemic. Although her name was added to the York Minster Memorial in 1925, it was not added to Downham Market's Memorial until 2015. Alvinia. Alvinia died in Heacham long after the war, and I think it's doubtful that her death was as a consequence of the war. It's likely that a relative puts her name forward in 1932 when names were asked for the cathedral book, simply because she had served. When we think about roles of honour, Sometimes they are referring to people who have died in the war. Sometimes they are referring to people who served in the war and fortunately survived. Anna Marjorie Wall. Anna was born in Essex, but despite that, her family, her father was a vicar, they moved to North Barsham when Anna was only 4, so we can count her as a Norfolk girl. She was an excellent administrator, just what was needed at the WAC Depot Hospital in Bristol, where she went, and then in France at the end of the war. In November 1918, she became very ill, possibly flu, and her father was told he could visit her. It's not known if he managed to do so before she died on the 6th of December. She's buried in the Saint Marie Cemetery in Le Havre, and her brother Edward also died in the war. Not surprisingly, only 3 of our women were married. Not surprising given the circumstances. Married women were doing their bit for the war in lots of other different ways. Gladys May Webb. Gladys also died long after the war. She'd worked as a waitress at Broadlands, a base for Australian and American soldiers. In 1921, she married Cyril Hawkins and they lived in Hastings. He'd been badly wounded in France and was invalided out of the war and subsequently set up a dental practice there. In 1927, Gladys became seriously ill and she went to be nursed at her parents' home in Heacham. Cyril, recovering from influenza, travelled to Norfolk to see her. On the way, he caught a chill, which worsened his condition. On returning to Hastings, he heard that Gladys had had a relapse. Cyril collapsed and died, and Gladys died 25 days later. Her name was added to the cathedral book just before it opened. Again, her name put forward by her family. Rose Alice Martin Jones. Rose is the lady standing by the doorway in that photo. Her husband Samuel was vicar at Wymondham Abbey. They had 4 children. This photo is of the hospital that she set up in Wymondham. And as I said, Rose is there standing at the back, an indefatigable worker in the parish. Rose's death was reported as tragic and unexpected. Her body was laid out in the Abbey the night before her funeral, and VADs, voluntary aid detachments from the Red Cross, and special constables kept a vigil. She was given a full military funeral, her coffin on a gun carriage covered with a Union flag processed through the town. Shops and businesses closed, and the funeral was attended by many local dignitaries and groups. Our other married lady is Barbara Ellen Goodwin. Barbara came from a very famous family of innkeepers in Norfolk, the Harveys. She'd married Walter Goodwin and they went to live in Derbyshire, but she came back to Norfolk when he went off to war. She only enlisted on condition that she could travel from King's Lynn Station, so she was sent to Narborough Aerodrome to work alongside her sister Mary in the repair shops. And this photo actually shows Barbara in one of the planes at Narborough. Narborough on the way to King's Lynn, if you're wondering where the village is. Barbara succumbed to the flu epidemic. She died at her parents' Crown public house with her sister Mary by her side. She's buried at St Mary's in Great Massingham. Her sister Mary and her brother Dick, who served in the household cavalry, both survived the war. Barbara's memorial plaque remains in the family. The family were in close contact with us during this project, which was lovely to experience. While many of our women died through illness, there were some unique circumstances for some of our women. Beris, Selina, Frances, Burton, Fanning. 2 of our women died in tragic accidents. Beris here was the daughter of a well-known and respected family in the city. Her father was a doctor. Her mother did a lot for charity. Beris would help her mother, welcoming wounded soldiers at Thorpe Station before they transferred to the War Hospital at Thorpe. As a VAD, she transferred to Cambridge in August 1916, where her father was also the medical officer. The quote there in orange is from the local newspaper at the time. On the 21st of October 1916, Beres was sitting by the fire having finished her shift. A spark from the fire set her nightdress alight. Beres died from shock following severe burns. She was buried at Little Shelford in Cambridgeshire, and this is her headstone now lying in the grass. The press gave significant coverage of her death. In 1919, the family set up the Beres Burton Fanning Memorial Fund in her name to support nurses at the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital. Beres's parents also lost their son Newell in the First World War and their son Ralph in the Second. Blanche. Blanche's family lived in Martham when the war broke out. Her father worked as a railway gatekeeper. Blanche had suffered from chlorosis, a severe form of anemia which weakens the heart, since childhood. Despite that, she joined the Women's Land Army. In 1919, she was driving a tractor when it caught fire. The shock caused Blanche to have a heart attack and she died. It is good to note that her name was put on Martham's memorial at the same time as her brothers Harry, who was killed in Flanders in 1915. Mary Rodwell. Mary is probably the only one of our women who we can say was killed in action. She worked on the hospital ship Anglia, which was on its way back from France with wounded soldiers when it struck a mine. There were only 4 nurses on board that ship, and they are shown on this illustration from London News, helping to put wounded soldiers into lifeboats. Mary refused to leave the ship. Survivors reported that she had said to them, "We have the right to be last this time." Initially reported as missing, her war records just states struck mine, lost at sea. Mary is only one of 3 whose name also appears with the men of her parish in the cathedral book. Why are some remembered and others not? We all know the story of Edith Cavell, executed for helping Allied soldiers escape. Was she Red Cross? Most websites say yes, but the Red Cross website does not include her. She was already working in the Brussels hospital as a nurse when it was taken over by the Red Cross in 1914, so yes and no. The Red Cross is not entirely comfortable either with what she did. They are a politically neutral organisation, but Edith's actions were not political. You decide. So what to say about Edith that you don't already know? She did love her dogs. This photo is of her with her dogs in her garden in Brussels. The dog on the left is Jack, who was rescued by one of Edith's friends after Edith was executed. For every family, there was loss. Some of our women's stories reveal the depth of love, devotion, and duty evident in wartime. Alice. Alice lived at Crow Hall. She was one of 12 children. All of them had pet names, which were pinned on the back of the outside toilet door. Alice was Moo Cow. We know that Sister Ada was Bulldog. Cyril was Sprat. George was Peacock. I don't know who was Bloater or why they gave certain names to certain children, but I think it says a lovely thing about the family that they had these nicknames for each other. Alice was at Tidmouth, and there she contracted TB, and she came home. They built a special wooden hut at the end of the garden where she was nursed by her mother to avoid infecting the rest of the family. Alice died in December 1921, and she was buried in Brockdish churchyard. Her mother died of TB 6 years later. Alice's siblings, Ada, Cyril, and George, also served, and they all survived the war. And the family are still hoping that Alice's names can be added to the Brockdish Memorial one day. She is on the memorial for York Minster, but she's not on the memorial for Brockdish. Susanna Hall. So let's come back to this identity bracelet. A. Hall, actually Susanna Hall, known in her family as Susie. But when she joined the WAC, she gave her name as Annie. Her mother and eldest sister were both Annies. We don't know why she gave her name as Annie. It's a common thing which makes history research difficult at times. This photo shows Susanna standing with her sisters, Olive and Hilda, who are sitting. They also joined QMAC. Her family were innkeepers and boat builders, and she had 10 siblings. Susanna succumbed to the flu pandemic, and she's buried at Tollington British Cemetery, Vimille, Pas-de-Calais. In 1917, 2 of her brothers, James and Jack, were killed in France. In 1918, her brother Ernest was killed in action at sea. This quote here from a handwritten letter of condolence from the Bishop of Norwich was sent after the 3rd brother was killed. I grieve so deeply for you in your triple loss. Little did they know they were to lose Susanna the following year. Susanna's name was added to Reedham's Memorial in 1995 following local history research. Sadly, her memorial plaque and those of her 3 brothers are in private hands. Apparently they were discovered in a junk shop in Great Yarmouth and somebody clearly purchased them. When we had the project in 2018, her great niece Josie got very involved with us in telling Susanna's story and helped lay the wreath on Remembrance Day in remembrance of all these women. The Easter Sisters. So while most of our women are commemorated somewhere, the Easter Sisters have no memorials to their name. Ivy was the older by a year. The girls were the only 2 children in the family, and they worked in the doping sheds at Narborough Aerodrome. So dope was a very toxic substance that they painted onto the fabric of aeroplanes, and it made the skin of the aeroplanes very taut. Obviously no PPE or health and safety in those days. Ivy was demobbed in December 1918. Stella stayed on until September 1919. From excellent local history research in Narborough, it is recorded that their deaths were attributable to working with the dope. When war broke out, the great fear of losing men, I don't think it entered Mr. and Mrs. Easter's minds that they would lose their daughters. At the exhibition that we had following this project, this lady came up to me, and she'd come up from London that day to visit her great aunt. She saw the exhibition and she said, "My name is Stella, and that is my great aunt." And that was lovely to make that sort of family connection. They have no memorial now other than that of our Perspex lady, which I will tell you about at the end. Gladys Cobb. Gladys lived with her family, who owned a harness shop in Gaywood before enlisting. Her record states she was an ordinary worker, but in this photo she's wearing the white collar of a quartermistress, a rank in line with sergeant. That may have been a deputising role at the time of this photo. Gladys died of influenza and toxic jaundice at Stonar Camp Hospital in Richborough, and she's buried at King's Lynn's Gaywood Cemetery. Her memorial plaque remains with the family. Her brothers, William and Harry, served in the war. William survived, but Harry did not. Her younger brother attempted to enlist, but his mother told the authorities to send him back because he was underage. They did, but he enlisted as soon as he was old enough. Fortunately, he did survive. Alice Long, no relation. She was already a qualified nurse when war broke out. She had significant military nursing experience. She came back from Zululand in 1915 to join Quames as a nurse, but soon became a sister. In Malta, she nursed soldiers coming back from the Dardanelles and Salonika. She became ill in 1916 and came back to England. It was seen as a heart condition aggravated by the climate. She was deemed fit for light duties only and invalided out of Quames. She tried to rejoin, but they refused. She died at her father's home in the Close, number 10, I think of Alice every time I walk past number 10 in the close. Her brother was Dr. Sidney Herbert Long, founder of the Norfolk Naturalist Trust and also a doctor at the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital. He introduced the Alice Long Memorial Medal for the most efficient probationary nurse. Service women were treated quite differently to service men, and on occasion not very well at all. Violet Meals. Violet came from a railway family and no doubt took on her porter job as men went off to war. This is not a photo of Violet, unfortunately, but it is a female railway porter. Adrique was an ammunition depot in France, in Calais, in France. And she was sent there, and while she was there, she developed TB. She was treated for TB, and then she came back to England, to the Cumac Hospital in Isleworth. She was then sent back to her family in 1920, who were in Caister at the time, while a place in a sanatorium was arranged at the Brompton Hospital in Fulham. Illness caused serious financial difficulties for women. In hospital, she asked Cumac to send her pay. This is before the National Health Service. She had not had any pay for months. She asked for £4 and they sent her 2. Even the hospital was prompted to write on her behalf. And that's an excerpt from the letter on the right-hand side. She was borrowing money from patients because she had no money. Violet died of TB in April 1920. Soldiers' families received compensation at death. Families of service women did not. Her brothers Percy and Norman died at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. Violet's grave is in Caister Cemetery. Mental health issues are much better understood today, but not so much in World War I. This is the sad story of Lillian Duffin. She was a qualified nurse driven by her vocation. She's described in her nursing reports while training as rather odd. In 1922, after serving throughout the First World War, she complained of feeling unwell. Her symptoms, what we would recognise today as post-traumatic stress syndrome. Then she was diagnosed with neurasthenia. Her health did not improve, and in 1922 she was certified insane and sent to the Bethel Hospital in Norwich. She was then transferred to a hospital in Camberwell, and she died there 4 years later. Two stories are as a result of amazing strokes of luck on my part, not on the ladies' parts, unfortunately. Mary Matthews, I was able to trace at the time Mary's great-nephew, Victor, a very elderly gentleman, who told me that when his mother, not Mary, when his mother died, his brothers had gone to clear the house. Victor thought he would go up and see what they had cleared, and he went through the dustbins, and he found Mary's nursing album. Mary was his great aunt. Many nurses kept albums and autograph books, and these are a wealth of historical information. So thank goodness Victor turned up before the bin men. Mary died in France in 1919, probably from influenza, and she's buried at Étaples Military Cemetery in Calais. There's a sample there from her autograph book. You have photos, you have soldiers' writings, you have poems, you have lovely things in nurses' autograph books kept at the time. And then Violet. This amazing photo shows Violet and her friend Florence at South Carlton, sitting right at the end here. I don't know how well you can see. So this is, we've got Violet here and her friend Florence. And the other red ring right down at the end is the RAF cat that they had. So Violet joined initially as a WAC, and then Cumac, and then on the 1st of April, when her base became an RAF base, she became a member of the Women's Royal Air Force. This photo was taken at that very time of transition from WAC to RAF. Violet, like most of our women, was single. So I went with my husband to see Violet's grave in North Elmham, which is where she was from. And there was an elderly gentleman in there tidying up the church, wondered why we were there. And I explained, and he said, "Oh, her granddaughter lives in the village," which took me back a little bit. So the story unfolded after I got in touch with her granddaughter that Violet had left home to work in domestic service in Norwich. When this photo was taken, Violet was 4 to 5 months pregnant and concealing it very well, in my opinion. Otherwise, she would have been dismissed. She went to Leeds to have her baby. As soon as she had the baby, she took the baby home to her parents and then returned to South Carlton Aerodrome to continue with her work. Violet died from influenza in 1919. Her body was returned to North Elmham, where she had a full military funeral. We think the father was probably the wealthy businessman that she'd worked in Norwich in service for, because every year a very wealthy gentleman in a very big car would visit Violet's parents and visit the daughter until the daughter was 14 years of age. Violet's granddaughter, who still lives in the village, knew nothing at all about this photograph because we'd managed to trace Florence's great-nephew. Previous slide. And he had this photograph, and the story goes that Florence, who was married, left the RAF to have a baby, and when she had her baby, she called it Violet, which is lovely. The plaque is still with the family, and it has this rather strange frame around it because next door to Violet's mum lived the undertaker, and Violet's mum used to make him stew, so he made the frame for the memorial plaque to say thank you. So what did these women have in common? What legacy have they left? This is from Mary Matthews' autograph album. "Life is short, old age will come. So go it, Mary, while life is young." Most were young and single. Some saw it as an opportunity to see the world. All had a very strong sense of duty. So these two poignant images that you can see here, the identity bracelet, which doesn't identify Susanna, and the poem, which didn't bring Mary any luck. These women were pioneers, starting the development of the role of women in the military. And they remind us too that they were also serving their country in their own way. It's also a negative legacy, the families they did not have and the descendants who are not sitting here today. So we're all familiar with this image. In 2018, the Tommy figure appeared all over the country. It was a powerful image and a powerful reminder. And when we were taking this project, we decided we needed a figure of our own for the 25 women we had found. And for the Easter sisters, it was and is their only memorial. So we had a Perspex lady made. She stands about 5'5" tall, and it has the names on of all of our 25 women. Unfortunately, it's not with me today, but I have brought a much smaller poster of it with me. So if you wanted to look at that, and that stands as our memorial. Thank you for listening.